Is he really getting on this flight? A sharp voice cut through the boarding line. Heads turned, eyes narrowing at the man who had just stepped onto the jet bridge. He was a black farmer, clothes worn thin, jacket torn at the elbow, and an American traditional turban wrapped proudly around his head. His steps were steady, but every movement seemed to invite ridicule. A businessman snickered to his neighbor. "Wrong terminal, buddy. The farm trucks are outside." The neighbor chuckled, shaking his head. The farmer didn't reply. He clutched his ticket, gaze forward, as though the comments slid past him like rain off steel. But the whispers followed him, low at first, then louder, spreading like a storm through the cabin. "Hope he's not in my row." "Smells like the fields." "What kind of man dresses like that on a plane?" Each word sliced the air, each laugh echoing as he walked the narrow aisle. Passengers leaned back, shifting away as though contact with his frayed sleeves would stain their polished suits. A woman pressed her child closer to the window. The farmer kept moving, turban upright like a crown, unbothered in appearance. Yet his silence carried a weight that unsettled even those mocking him. He reached his seat, placed his worn bag beneath the chair, and sat with a calm that felt almost defiant. Around him, the mutters continued, feeding off one another, painting him as an outsider. A flight attendant offered a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed the same unease. Engines hummed alive beneath the wings, the cabin vibrating with power. The farmer closed his eyes for a moment, hands folded, as though he'd done this countless times before. But the passengers saw only torn fabric and a turban, and they whispered louder, blind to the storm building just beyond their judgment. Because soon, their laughter would falter, and their whispers would choke into sill. Chipper! The flight had only just begun, and already the tension was crackling in the air. The moment he lowered himself into his seat, the snickering began. It wasn't hidden, not whispered behind cupped hands this time. It was open, sharp, and cutting. "Look at those shoes," one young man muttered loud enough for half the row to hear. "I've seen scarecrows dressed better." His friend burst into laughter, glancing over his shoulder at the farmer's torn jacket and turban. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband. "Why do they even let people like that fly? He doesn't look safe. He looks out of place." The husband nodded, smirking, his eyes never leaving the farmer's head wrap. The farmer sat still, hands folded gently in his lap. His turban sat neatly, a symbol of tradition and pride, but to the mocking crowd it was nothing more than fuel for their shallow judgments. He didn't shift. He didn't defend himself. His silence became its own kind of answer, and somehow that bothered them more than if he had spoken. The laughter grew bolder. "Bet he's never been on a plane before," someone from behind scoffed. "Probably thinks this is a flying tractor." A ripple of chuckles followed, bouncing through the cabin like cruel echoes. But one child, seated 2 rows ahead, turned and stared quietly at the farmer. Unlike the adults, her eyes weren't mocking. They were curious, almost respectful. The farmer caught her gaze, gave a small, reassuring nod, and the child smiled faintly before turning back. It was a quiet moment, a reminder that not everyone in the cabin was blind to dignity. Around him, though, the mockery kept rising. Yet the farmer's face remained calm, unreadable. His stillness was unsettling, as if he carried knowledge the others couldn't touch. And as the cabin settled for takeoff, their voices faded into whispers again. But the tension they create had lingered in the air like smoke. Because while they saw only torn clothes and a turban, none of them realized. He was listening to more than just their insults. He was watching. He was waiting. And soon, those same voices would scream for the very man they laughed at. It began with something small. A man in the middle rows stood abruptly, glancing around with nervous eyes. He whispered something to his companion, who shifted uneasily in his seat. At first it seemed like nothing, just passengers stretching their legs. But then another figure rose, this time near the back. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, and the cabin crew noticed. One flight attendant froze, hand hovering near the call button. She whispered to her colleague, "Something's not right." The air changed instantly. Conversation slowed. Eyes darted toward the restless passengers, and unease rippled like a silent wave through the cabin. The group who had mocked the farmer earlier seized the moment to laugh again, though their voices carried a hint of nervousness now. "Well," one man sneered, "looks like we've got some excitement. Too bad Farmer Joe over here can't do anything about it." Another chimed in, "Yeah, unless ploughing fields is going to save us." Their laughter was louder than the situation demanded, an attempt to mask their own growing fear. Through it all, the farmer remained still, his posture calm, his hands steady on his lap. But his eyes, sharp, unblinking, tracked every movement of the suspicious passengers. Where others saw random gestures, he noticed signals. Where others panicked, he observed patterns. The nervous chatter in the cabin grew. A mother clutched her child tighter, whispering, "Stay close to me." The seatbelt signs glowed again as turbulence rattled the plane, heightening the tension. One attendant stepped forward cautiously, her voice firm but trembling. "Sir, please return to your seat." The standing man didn't move. He only exchanged another look with his companion. The air thickened with anticipation, passengers holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The farmer shifted slightly in his seat, his turban catching the dim cabin light. He exhaled slowly, as though bracing for the inevitable. The passengers mocking him noticed and scoffed again. "Look at him, pretending he knows what's going on. Bet he's more scared than all of us." But his face told another story. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. Experience. Because while the cabin spiraled into whispers and doubt, he alone could see the storm forming clearly. And soon, when panic threatened to take over completely, his true role on this flight would begin to surface. But before anyone could find comfort in that truth, the situation was about to escalate beyond anything they imagined. The first jolt came without warning. The plane dropped suddenly, sending drinks splashing and gasps rippling through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled violently, and seatbelts strained against startled passengers. A baby cried out. Voices rose in panic, and the calm of the flight shattered in an instant. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." The captain's voice boomed over the speakers, steady but tense. The words did little to calm the passengers as the plane rocked again, harder this time. Hands gripped armrests, knuckles whitening. Amid the chaos, laughter pierced through, sharp and mocking. One of the passengers from earlier leaned toward his friend, sneering at the farmer seated quietly in his row. "Look at him. He's frozen stiff. What's that turban going to do for us now, huh?" Another chuckled nervously, adding, "Yeah, he looks like he's praying we don't crash. Some hero." Their voices, loud enough to be heard, carried cruel amusement even as fear twisted their faces. But the farmer didn't respond. He sat steady, shoulders squared, his breathing calm while others clung desperately to their seats. His turban, lit by the dim glow of the overhead lamps, stood out like a silent crown in the storm. Every bump, every violent shake, only seemed to sharpen the focus in his eyes. Passengers around him began to notice. A woman across the aisle, trembling, whispered, "How is he so calm?" Her husband, sweating and pale, shook his head. "Doesn't make sense. Unless—" His words trailed off, swallowed by another violent jolt that sent trays crashing to the floor. The turbulence seemed endless, each drop of altitude stretching seconds into hours. The cabin swayed between shrieks and silence, the air thick with fear. Yet the farmer remained composed, scanning the cabin with a gaze that was anything but ordinary. It wasn't the gaze of a man overwhelmed. It was the gaze of a man assessing, measuring, preparing. Meanwhile, the mocking passengers grew louder, desperate to mask their own terror. "Hey, farmer, maybe you can grow us wings," one shouted nervously, forcing laughter that quickly died when the plane plunged again. Their bravado was cracking, their jokes revealing more fear than courage. Through it all, the farmer's stillness became more unsettling than the turbulence itself. He looked less like a man waiting for fate, and more like someone who already knew exactly what to do. And as the turbulence raged on, shaking the plane like a leaf in a storm, one truth began to surface. The calmest man on the flight was the one everyone underestimated. But before they could understand why, the true crisis was about to erupt. The first scream tore through the cabin like glass shattering. A man near the back lunged into the aisle, his voice raised in a harsh command. Another passenger stood almost in unison, their movements sharp, deliberate. Panic erupted instantly. Children cried, adults froze, and the flight attendants stumbled backward, their trays clattering to the floor. "Sit down!" one of the attendants shouted, voice trembling, but the intruders didn't listen. Instead, one of them pushed forward, eyes wild, scanning the plane as if daring anyone to resist. The oxygen seemed to vanish, replaced by fear thick enough to choke. Passengers cowered, shrinking into their seats. A woman clasped her hands around her child's face, whispering desperately, "Don't look! Don't look!" The businessmen who had mocked the farmer earlier now clutched their armrests, their earlier arrogance drained to nothing. One hissed under his breath, "Where's security? Where's anyone?" But no one moved. No one. Except him. The farmer, seated quietly all this time, rose slowly to his feet. His torn jacket shifted with the motion, and his turban stood firm under the dim cabin lights. Gasps spread through the rows as all eyes fell on him. Even the intruders paused for a brief moment, their confidence shaken by the calm way he stood. "What's he doing?" one of the mocking passengers muttered, panic in his voice. "He'll just get himself killed," another snapped back. "Yeah, sit down, old man." But the farmer didn't sit. He stepped into the aisle, posture steady, eyes locked on the danger ahead. His calm presence cut through the chaos like a blade. The whispers that had once mocked him were now laced with something else entirely. Fear, confusion, even a trace of reluctant respect. The intruder at the back sneered. "Sit down before you get hurt." His voice was hard, but his grip on control was slipping. The farmer said nothing. He simply took another step forward, his silence more commanding than any threat. The cabin fell eerily still, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Flight attendants exchanged terrified glances. Passengers held their breath, and yet in the middle of chaos, the farmer seemed unshaken, as if he had faced storms like this before. For the first time since boarding, the mocking crowd stopped laughing. Their eyes darted between the threat and the man they once belittled, and realization began to stir. There was something in his gaze, something they hadn't seen before, experience, authority. And as the plane shook again with another bout of turbulence, the farmer braced himself, his calm unbroken. The cabin had fallen into silence, waiting to see what this man, the man in torn clothes and a turban, would do next. For a heartbeat, the cabin froze. The farmer stood in the aisle, steady against the trembling plane, every eye locked on him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the dull roar of the engines and the terrified breaths of passengers. Then, with a voice calm yet commanding, he spoke. "Everyone, remain seated. Do not panic. You are safe." The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. His tone was not shaky or meek. It carried weight, authority, the kind of voice that instantly demanded obedience. Even the intruders hesitated, their false bravado faltering. One of the mocking men scoffed nervously. "What are you, some kind of preacher?" But before the laughter could rise again, the farmer reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim leather case. With one precise motion, he flipped it open, revealing a polished badge gleaming under the cabin lights. Gasps erupted across the rows. Mouths fell open. Eyes widened. The farmer's voice didn't waver as he declared, "My name is Samuel Carter, head of aviation security for this entire region, and this aircraft is under my watch." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The passengers who had ridiculed him for his torn clothes and turban now stared in stunned disbelief. Their earlier words echoed in their own minds like poison. The man they had mocked as out of place was the very person trained and authorized to protect them at 30,000 feet. One woman covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God!" Another man who had laughed earlier dropped his gaze, shame spreading across his face. The intruders stiffened, suddenly aware they weren't dealing with an ordinary traveler. The weight of his badge and his calm, unshakable posture stripped them of their dominance. The farmer's eyes locked on them, unblinking, fearless. Passengers leer, Ned in whispering frantically to each other, "He's the head of aviation security, all this time." The child who had smiled at him earlier tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "I knew he was special." The cabin, once filled with jeers, was now silent, not out of mockery, but out of awe. The farmer, once dismissed as weak, now stood revealed as the strongest presence in the sky. And as the realization settled like thunder in their chests, one truth became clear. The flight was no longer in danger of spiraling into chaos. Because the man they underestimated was about to take control. But to restore order completely, he would first have to face the threat head-on. The cabin hung in silence, broken only by the rumble of engines and the faint whimper of frightened children. All eyes locked on the man they had once mocked, the farmer in torn clothes, the man in the turban. But now, every passenger knew him for who he truly was, the head of aviation security. With a steady hand, Samuel Carter raised his badge high, then slipped it away. His voice cut through the air, firm but controlled. "Crew, secure the aisles. Passengers, stay seated. Do not interfere." The authority in his tone snapped the attendants into action. One grabbed the intercom, relaying instructions. Another quietly moved down the rows, steadying passengers who trembled. Order began to take shape under his command. The intruders, rattled but not yet defeated, shifted uneasily. One barked, "Stay back! Don't try anything!" His words lacked the conviction they had before. Samuel didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his presence filling the aisle. "You've already lost," he said evenly. "Surrender now, and no one gets hurt." Passengers gasped at the calm certainty in his words. The mocking men who once laughed at him sat stone-faced, shame burning on their cheeks. One whispered, under his breath, He knows exactly what he's doing." The lead intruder lunged, trying to shove past a flight attendant. In an instant, Samuel moved. His hands, precise and controlled, locked the man's arm and forced him back against the bulkhead. Gasps exploded around the cabin. It wasn't reckless aggression. It was training, discipline, the quiet power of someone who had done this before. "Restrain him," Samuel instructed, and two attendants rushed forward with flex cuffs. The intruder struggled, then stilled, realizing resistance was useless. The second suspect froze, wide-eyed, before sinking back into his seat in defeat. The entire cabin erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. Passengers leaned forward, whispering to one another, "He's incredible. He saved us. That man, he's not just a farmer." And through it all, Samuel Carter adjusted his turban, standing tall in the aisle. His clothes might have been torn, but his composure was flawless. He looked over the passengers, scanning each row until the fear began to settle into relief. In that moment, the man they had ridiculed had become their protector. The laughter was gone, replaced by gratitude and respect. As he returned to his seat, the tension in the air lifted just slightly, but the weight of what had happened still pressed heavy on every soul in that cabin. Because even though the immediate threat was contained, the echoes of prejudice and the lesson it carried were far from over. The storm had passed. The plane steadied, the engines humming with their familiar rhythm. But inside the cabin, silence reigned. Heavy, awkward, almost unbearable. Every passenger knew the truth now, and every passenger felt the weight of what they had said, what they had assumed. The same men who had mocked him earlier stared at their hands, their shoulders slumped. One of them tried to glance toward Samuel, but his eyes faltered, dropping to the floor before contact was made. The arrogance that once filled their voices had evaporated, leaving only shame. Across Tude. "I'll," a woman whispered to her husband. "We judged him so quickly." Her voice cracked with guilt. The husband only nodded, unable to speak. And yet, Samuel Carter, the man they had ridiculed for his torn clothes and turban, showed no trace of resentment. He stood tall, adjusting the wrap on his head with quiet dignity, then addressed the passengers in a calm, steady tone. "You are safe now. There's no need to be afraid." His words weren't just reassurance for their fear. They were grace for their guilt. No bitterness, no rebuke. Just strength wrapped in humility. A few passengers lowered their heads, tears stinging their eyes at the kindness they didn't deserve. A child's small voice broke the silence. "Mom, he saved us." The little girl leaned over her seat, smiling at Samuel. Her innocence, untouched by prejudice, struck harder than any lecture ever could. The farmer gave her a gentle nod, his eyes softening for the first time since the ordeal began. The plane glided forward, and though order had been restored, the weight of unspoken apologies hung in the air. The mocking laughter that once filled the cabin had been replaced with quiet reflection. The man they had dismissed as less than had proven himself to be more courageous, more composed, more human than any of them had dared to recognize. And as the cabin lights dimmed and the passengers sank back into their seats, one truth lingered like a shadow over them all. They would never look at him, or anyone like him, the same way again. But the journey was not over. As the wheels prepared to touch down, the lesson would take its final shape. The wheels touched down with a heavy thud, the cabin jolting before settling into a smooth roll across the runway. A sigh of relief swept through the passengers. But this time, it wasn't just for the landing. It was for the safety, the calm, the order resto, read by the very man they had once scorned. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the silence was deafening. No one laughed. No one whispered cruel remarks. Instead, shame lingered in the air like an unspoken confession. The same businessman who had ridiculed his torn clothes stared at the floor. The woman who had mocked his turban wiped her eyes quietly. The seatbelt sign flicked off. People rose slowly, retrieving their bags with subdued movements, careful not to disturb the fragile silence. And there he was, Samuel Carter, still in his humble attire, turban tied firmly, dignity unshaken. Passengers shifted aside as he stepped into the aisle, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was respect. Some nodded. A few whispered, "Thank you." Most couldn't even meet his eyes, afraid their guilt would show. He didn't gloat. He didn't boast. Instead, he offered the same calm presence he had carried from the very beginning. To one trembling man, he said softly, "Travel safe." To a frightened mother, "You did well keeping your child calm." His words were few, but they carried a weight far heavier than any lecture could. At the jet bridge, Samuel paused. Behind him, the humbled crowd stood still, watching. Then he stepped forward, disappearing into the sea of travelers, swallowed by the ordinary bustle of the airport. But for those on that flight, he was unforgettable. They had seen with their own eyes that greatness doesn't come dressed in fine suits or polished shoes. Sometimes it comes in torn clothes and a turban, carrying dignity, strength, and quiet authority. The lesson was carved into their hearts. Never judge by appearances, because the person you dismiss may be the very one who saves you.